Dave, I want to tell you a story. It's a little illuminating about the world of higher education. This was a few years ago. A friend of mine who's a wonderful guardian in the Vino Veritas Society, and he's been deeply involved in the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. Many years, decades actually.
He's brought a few of the others in as well.
Yes, he has. And he invited me to a breakfast event there at the Chamber, downtown Denver. And it was actually an old friend of mine speaking, Professor Charles Murray, he's gained a little notoriety. I always laugh. I've known Charles for, 25 years. And he's a small little guy, and he's very soft-spoken, perfect gentleman. Oh, he's just a delightful human being. And he's kind of a statistics wonk. What Charles loves more than anything are databases. He loves to go through data and analyze things. But he caused some controversy. A book he published a while back titled The Bell Curve. He said, Americans are in love with affirmative action and having people check boxes and receive, different kinds of preferences or burdens based on the box they check. So he said, we now have decades of data. Let's go see how all these Americans checking different boxes have actually done. And that's all the bell curve is all about, is taking all of this affirmative action data and seeing how do different groups of people do on various tests and things like that. Well, he was the speaker at the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, and he gave a very nice talk on his recent book about the cultural divide in the United States. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, I got up during the Q&A, and I said, Professor Murray, we know each other, so he was chuckling. I said, we're at the Chamber of Commerce. These are all business people here. In fact, they're successful business people because it's not cheap to be part of the Chamber of Commerce. And you know what a lot of these people do here? In Denver, Colorado, as their businesses succeed and they make some money, they send money off to institutions of higher education. They feel that's a way of giving something back to the community, doing something good. They want to help educate young Americans. So I asked him to comment on that, and he proceeded to scold them. He looked at the audience. He said, "Good grief, people, stop sending your money to universities and colleges, especially the social sciences and the humanities." He said, you need to understand those parts of the universities, they are staffed with faculty who are trying to undermine the very conditions that made it possible for you business owners to do what you do, to succeed and thrive and be productive and produce value for others and create wealth for yourself. He said, if you really feel this burning desire to subsidize education, send your money to a vocational school. Teach young people how to become a welder or plumber or electrician or how to do something, right? Actually productive. But for goodness sake, make sure your money doesn't end up at the Women's Studies Department, right, at CU Boulder. I open with that story because as left-wing, as progressive, as socialist, as Marxist as CU is, as a
that was a little redundant, by the way, right?
It was.
Progressive,
yes,
socialist, Marx. It's all the same. Let's just be honest.
It is the same. One thing they cannot tolerate is anyone who even has a whiff of not being sufficiently progressive. And the current president, who's not been there long, he's only been there, I think, less than 2 years. His name's Mark Kennedy. He had as a background in the political world, the business world and the political world.
He was a congressman from Montana, or from North Dakota, sorry.
And actually, I think it was Minnesota.
No,
but
fairly certain it was North Dakota.
Okay, I'll trust your judgment on that. Here's the big controversy.
And if I'm wrong, let's blame it on my CU education.
Okay. But here's the rub. He was a Republican.
Right.
Wow, big R Republican. Now, he seems like a perfectly nice man, so I'm not going to say anything bad about him. I looked at his record when he was in Congress. He seemed like kind of a middle-of-the-road, squishy, sort of progressive type of Republican. He would brag about his bipartisan bills. He signed up for all kinds of subsidy programs and that sort of stuff.
Lisa Murkowski in it.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. So he's not some kind of serious, constitutionalist or conservative or anything like that. But he was Republican, and the Board of Regents that governs CU now has a progressive majority, and they said, enough is enough. We're not going to have this Republican here anymore as president, even though the president has been focusing on things like tuition and infrastructure and making sure the ordinary business of running a university. And what their complaint is, the faculty there actually censured him not too long ago, not for something he did, but for what he's not done. They said critical race theory concepts like diversity and equity and inclusiveness, this is what the president should be focused on, and he's not. He's not. They said he's not a leader in that area, and therefore he's not a very good fit.
Woodrow Wilson would be very disappointed in him.
That's right. So what the story is, he's not going to be the president of the University of Colorado at Boulder anymore. They're going to most definitely bring in someone far more left-wing, progressive, socialist, Marxist. Yep. And there's a very curious thing about that realm of higher education. Think about what that means. It's higher education. Education means to learn, to discover. I like to point out to people our English word education, the Latin root for it is educere. And educere means to lead out, to lead away, as in what it reminds me of is Plato's famous allegory where the philosopher is led out of the cave. The cave is the realm of images and illusions and shadows, and he's led out of the cave by the allure of the sun, by the prospect of actually seeing things as they really are, rather than just looking at illusions and shadows of things. And so that was sort of the model of education, to turn your mind and your soul toward the light, toward the truth, to understanding things what they really are, rather than simply accepting the myths, the stories, the comforting lies that really exist in any kind of political community. But that whole classical notion of education assumes there's something like the sun.
Right.
There's light. There are objects to be illuminated that you can see. There's truth.
That are true.
Yes.
That are the true forms.
Yes.
I think the other definition concept that's worth bringing up in this conversation, something you talk about quite a bit, and that's the root of college being about colleagues.
Yes.
College isn't a place for people to go and sit quietly in a classroom and be indoctrinated by whatever that professor wants them to know. The entire purpose of college was to gather with your colleagues and explore ideas in search of truth.
In fact, since we're on this topic, I'm going to go even a little farther. The word school has a Latin root of scholae, which meant leisure. Scholae, the word scholarship, school, all comes from that Latin word leisure. Education at the highest level was meant the kind of learning, discovering, the pursuit of truth, philosophizing. That is the proper thing for someone who has some leisure. When there are moments in your life where necessity isn't compelling you to be building something, growing something, making something, when you have quiet moments, that's when you can ask high questions. What is our purpose here as a human being? What's the right way of life? What kind of person should I be? Those kinds of very high, ultimate human questions, that's what should go on in a school, the scholae, the leisurely activity, and we do that together as colleagues, as partners in a college where it means education at that highest level is it's an activity. It's work. It's active. You don't just sit. I think many Americans today, young and old, they think education in terms of an empty vessel, and someone else is just pouring something in. Right? My brain is this empty thing, and the teachers just pour facts and dates and names and other things into my head. That's a very modern notion of education. The old classical notion was, we're partners in this work together, and you're going to think actively and speak and make arguments, and I'm going to do the same, and we listen to each other, and we challenge each other. We question if I think you made a mistake in your logic or you had something wrong, right? And we do that out of a mutual love for the truth. We each want to get closer to the truth, and so we're thinking together as partners in learning.
It recalls two very specific moments or occasions in history that I think about. One is something that we talk quite a bit about, and we will continue to talk quite a bit about, the Benjamin Franklin's Leather Apron Club. Right?
Yeah.
For somebody who didn't go past middle school, didn't finish middle school, or that age. I mean, I don't know how schools, primary, secondary, were divided in the 1720s, but for somebody who didn't exceed 6th, 7th grade, the pursuit of education, the pursuit of scholarly learning, the pursuit of having colleagues to spend his leisure time that he would discuss ideas never ended. And it didn't mean you don't work. You go to work, you work all day, and then your friends come over and you get together and they had exactly that experience.
Maybe drink a little wine, a little beer.
Drink a little wine,
Think.
A little Vino and Veritas.
A little Vino and Veritas, right?
So there was that, and then we've talked about some of the stories of the, I think, mostly early 20th century symposiums. Found on a lot of the college campuses. King's College in New York is one we've talked quite a bit about, where these scholars would get together and discuss their theories, their ideas. They would present them to a room with the intent and the purpose of having pushback, of getting people to push back on their ideas.
My professor, Harry Jaffa, he was just a great teller of stories. It's one of the reasons I loved him so much. And one of his favorite stories to tell, and I never tired of hearing this, when he was a graduate school there was an institution that began as, in fact, I don't know if anyone's actually told this story. It was called the New School for Social Research in New York City. And its origins were quite wonderful. It was a group of largely, not entirely, but largely German emigres, political refugees, which included a lot of Jews who were living in Germany in the 1930s. They could see, they saw very clearly where things were going. They thought, we got to leave. And so
one by the name of Einstein?
Albert Einstein, another by the name of Leo Strauss,
Right.
who was my teacher's main teacher.
Right.
And so you end up in the 1930s and 40s with this amazing graduate faculty at the New School for Social Research in New York City. Harry Jaffa, who was my teacher, he was a young man, a graduate student, and once a month they had this kind of symposium where they would have one other graduate faculty would give a presentation on whatever research they were working on, and the rest of the graduate faculty would be up on the stage too. So the main presenter would present whatever his working hypothesis was, and then the others would chime in and offer critiques and challenges, and then eventually the students got to ask questions, and it very much was a partnership. And it could get kind of tough sometimes because people were challenging each other and trying to refute each other, but it was all in the spirit of learning and getting closer to the truth. And then Professor Jaffa would always chuckle and he'd say, Leo Strauss was always the smallest man up there, and he was always the smartest one too. I don't know if that was true or not.
We think that way of our mentors usually.
That's right. That's right. But that, all of that kind of classical learning partnerships, what a school really should be, or a college or a university. And then you contrast that classical notion with the kind of nihilism and relativism, the progressive tribalism, the identity politics, the critical race theory that now dominates our universities. And it raises a really serious question, which is, what is the purpose of education according to these progressives who now teach in our universities? Because their premise typically is something like, there is no objective truth. Well, if there's no objective truth, then what does it mean to learn? What does it mean to be educated?
Even worse than there's no objective truth, one of the missing objective truths is we are not equal. I am the professor. What I say is correct. Your job is to regurgitate to me what I have told you, and don't you dare question me.
Right.
And we just saw this about a week or two ago, the Zoom video that was making the rounds about police. I don't know if you saw this. A professor was saying she would never call the police if somebody broke into her house, if somebody was trying to rob her, if somebody was trying to harm her. She would never call the police. And they are murderers and they are horrible people. And if she called the police, the likelihood of her getting harmed went up too much for her to ever call the police. And a student dared to raise his hand, his virtual Zoom hand, and say, so what would you do? Who would you call? Because you've told us all semester also that we don't have a right to, that we need gun control.
Yeah.
And that
we should be disarmed,
we should be
and defenseless.
disarmed and defenseless. And at the same time, I should not call the police. He's pushing back, saying essentially you're saying just give up your private property. Yeah. And if your life is taken away, so be it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where that conversation led. And there's no equality. She gets to say to him, yeah, you're not exploring truth.
Right.
You're not here. We're not here for that. I don't care what you think. I don't care to have a conversation. This isn't a back and forth like education was designed to be. This is designed for me to tell you how life is supposed to be, and you need to understand.
You know, I wasn't planning on going in this direction, but since we're here, I'm going to weave this theme into our thread. You really see the difference in these two models of education. An education as a partnership where we're working together. Mm-hmm. And even in the classical model, right, the professor has a little more experience. He's read more, he's thought about these things more, but still we're exploring these topics together versus the kind of indoctrination, right? You shall think what I tell you to think. Yep. And you can see this in the differences in curriculum. One of the beautiful things about a great books curriculum or curriculum that consists of original source material is you can approach a third party. Say you're reading a book by Plato or Aristotle or Machiavelli or a speech written by Thomas Jefferson or George, whatever it is. A good professor isn't presenting that as gospel truth. They're saying, here's a thoughtful mind that makes some interesting arguments. Mm-hmm. Let's analyze this together. Does it make sense? Are there mistakes? Right? And you're together as partners. You're critiquing this third body of literature, which is the original source material, as opposed to the textbook model. The whole concept of a textbook is here are the facts you must know. We've condensed it down into a textbook. You now memorize the content of chapter 1, and you're going to get a test on chapter 1, right? And there really is no thoughtful critique and learning and thinking with a textbook the way that there is with original source material.
Well, and then you start to wonder, what is the textbook's approach? Is the textbook just presenting facts, or is the textbook presenting opinion as facts, and who is writing it and who is assigning it? And I mean,
many years ago, when I was at the Claremont Institute, we dabbled, not very long, just for a little period of time, we dabbled in the world of textbooks. We had this ambition. We thought, hey, we're smart guys. We'll produce textbooks, right? And we'll send them out to schools all over. And we quickly learned there's this enormous industry, and it's very much closed. The big wigs at big textbook producers, the biggest used to be, it might still be Houghton Mifflin.
I think
they made more textbooks than anybody in the world. They were very closely connected, like to all the state and federal departments of education. So when a state department of education would sit down to discuss changing standards or changing curriculum, Houghton Mifflin representatives would be in the room with them. And they're all, so that by the time the discussion was over, right, Houghton Mifflin already had the contract that was going to go to all the schools. And it's very hard to break into these things. But part of that work of looking at textbooks, one of my assignments, I was reviewing American history, high school and college level textbooks. And I looked at dozens and dozens of them. And there was one textbook in particular I'll never forget. It had one mention of George Washington. This is a textbook on American history. And it had a little picture of him up in the upper right-hand corner, and the caption said that he was a slaveholder. And that was the one fact, that was the one piece of datum about George Washington that textbook presented.
So here's the question that presents to me. The question I keep thinking about, was that writer of that textbook, we're now generations into the indoctrination of grad school programs and education.
Right.
Was that writer intentionally leaving things out, or had that writer become so indoctrinated that that's all they thought was relevant, and they were being what they thought was truthful?
Yep.
That they thought that was all that was relevant.
Very likely the latter. Very likely the latter.
And this brings me, it makes me think about my first experience on CU's campus. And you're laughing because I've told you this story before.
Well, and people, all of our listeners might know this. Like you suffered through 4 years at the University of Colorado at Boulder, the Boulder campus, which is the real kind of nut job campus.
Yeah. And I was third generation of my family to attend.
Okay.
Both my father and stepfather went there in the 60s.
Okay.
Although I've heard Boulder was a little more libertarian leaning at the time in the 60s than it was necessarily leftist.
I think there was a big hippie element there, just sort of leave me alone.
There was, and this is a total side tangent, but there is this fascinating, growing, freedom-oriented, Republican voting hippie movement happening in the United States today, and I'm finding it absolutely fascinating.
Sure.
These are people who are just realizing all that Woodstock stuff and all of that was about small government and being left alone. And I don't know where we lost our way, but I want to go back to that.
Yep.
And I wonder what that's going to do to things like Burning Man Festival and things like that, right? But total side note. And I'm one of these weird people who, I was a political science major at CU. I took enough philosophy classes that I ended up 3 or 6 credits shy of a minor in philosophy.
Okay.
I took them because I enjoyed them. I took them because I loved them. One of my favorite classes in college was literally an entire semester on Plato's Republic. Mm-hmm. It was just interesting to me, and so I took those classes. And I was one of these rare people who went into the University of Colorado as a leftist Democrat. I didn't really know what that meant at the time.
Right.
But grew up in a house with teachers.
Yep.
And Jewish, and that's a pretty common thing. And I left a freedom person. I left after listening to my professors thinking, none of this makes any sense. Everything you're telling me makes no sense.
They actually pushed you the other way.
They pushed me the other way.
They didn't attract you to them.
But it started with one moment. I will never forget this.
Okay.
So I'm up at Boulder. It's early fall. Weather is beautiful, like it is usually in the fall in Colorado. And I'm sitting out. There's a nice fountain area right by the student union. And there's all the restaurants inside. And I just grabbed lunch, and I'm in between classes. And I'm sitting there, and this cute blonde girl walks up to me, and I'm thinking, okay,
this is what college is all about.
This is what I came
right
to college for.
I get
this is why I chose CU.
Yep.
And she says hi, and I say hi, and figure, okay, great, gonna have a nice conversation. And then she hands me a flyer, and it says "Free Palestine," and I'm sitting there thinking, okay. So one of my favorite '90s movies was the movie PCU. I don't know if you ever saw it. Jeremy Piven and Jon Favreau, a lot of the big leftists.
Politically correct university, right? I vaguely remember it.
It stood for both Port Chester University and Politically Correct University. And there's a scene at the end. They bring George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic to the campus to have a fundraiser to support their fraternity. And the whole thing was to just go against the system and be free and let people do what they want. And everyone else on the school everybody else at the school is trying to get them to believe in their cause, right? They say women are unequal. And this is the 90s. So we're still having the same conversations today. But women aren't treated equally. These people are being oppressed. You should be a vegan. All of these things. And I'm sitting there, and immediately my mind goes to PCU. And I'm like, oh, great. This is going to be one of those conversations. I just simply asked questions. I sat there.
As you held this flyer saying, Free Palestine.
Now, most people look at me and they say he's a Jew. There's no doubt, right? I get it.
Well, of course, too, we know I'm bad at these things. You know this about me.
Yes,
I can never
I do.
tell what people are.
I do.
I rely on you for these things.
But it's not out of the realm, right?
Okay.
So she walks up to me and gives me this free Palestine. I said, who are the I don't know what Palestine is.
Right.
Explain this to me. What's going on there? She's like, they're oppressed. I said, who's oppressed? How are they oppressed? I'm not even arguing with her.
Yeah.
She gets frustrated simply that I'm asking questions, which what we just talked about is the foundation of education. And she gets frustrated that I'm actually asking questions. I'm not even pushing back.
Right.
And she throws the flyer at me and says, "You're the problem," and storms off. And all of a sudden, my 4 years ahead in college didn't look as bright as they did those first couple weeks.
And I think that's a lot what goes on in colleges and universities today. I say this as someone who has spent a lot of time. I at first as a student, going all the way through a PhD, and I was around as a student for a long time. I ended up writing three dissertations, only one that I turned in for my PhD defense. But I loved being a student. I love researching. I love writing, and I still do it. Really, in that sense, my life hasn't changed. I continue to read and write and talk and debate and learn any way I can. And then, of course, I've taught on a number of college campuses. And what I think is one of the things that has happened on college and university campuses is that the notion of investigation and discovery and dialectic and debate, right? Making arguments and counter arguments and in earnest, like in genuine, good faith, actually trying to figure out what's true. That really has been replaced with advocacy. I think a lot of students show up thinking their purpose is to advocate for some cause that they care about, which usually ends up being some progressive, some flavor of Marxism. They're going to advocate for that thing. And this is kind of what makes that whole realm of education so dangerous is, well, it sort of reminds me that there's a very close parallel between the world of education and the world of religion. It's like this. I've asked this question of many people, and I asked myself, have there been many false religions in the world? Sure. And of course, everyone agrees there are. Some real cynical, skeptical people will say all religions are false religions. And then even serious religious believers will acknowledge, well, yeah, there have been many false religions. There have been religions based on lies and untrue myths. And
I mean, the conversation just begins by asking certain people, is there a God?
Right.
Right? I mean, if you're going to have a conversation of their false religions, a lot of people, before they even get there, is there a God? And once they agree that there's a God, which religion is the right God?
Right. Exactly. And so everyone agrees there are false religions. There have been many false religions throughout history. And the question is, how is it so many people, probably large, probably in the billions of human beings over the course of many thousands of years, have been attracted to false religions? How does that happen? And it turns out if you grow up in an environment where everyone around you seems to believe in the same thing, they seem to agree on the same thing, it's rare to find the person who pushes back against that. They exist, they're out there, but a lot of people just kind of go along with it. Well, everybody around me seems to agree that this is the truth, so that's what I'm going to believe too. That's what happens with false religions. That's the seductive power of education. And the truth is, education has been taken over by progressives going back a century. Going all the way back to John Dewey's theoretical writings on how to create an entirely new education system,
right,
including departments of education where we train people not in any subject matter, but we train them to be teachers. We train them to be part of the education system. When you surround kids from very young ages all the way into their 20s around a certain perspective, a kind of cult.
Sure.
You surround them with a progressive cult, you're going to get a large percentage of them being indoctrinated, and they walk out just assuming that's the truth of the world, and anyone who doesn't agree must be crazy, which kind of brings me back to We mentioned before that famous allegory that Plato presents in the Republic. When you read it carefully, so the cave represents any kind of political environment, any kind of city, any kind of cause, there are certain myths and illusions that most people don't know if they're true or not, but they hold on to them, they uphold them as really important, as sacred in some cases. And the philosopher is the one who starts raising questions. Well, is that actually true? Sort of like what you did with the gal who handed you the flyer about Palestine.
I understood in that moment why everybody hated Socrates, by the way.
Yeah. Well, it's the perfect example.
Yeah.
When Plato describes it, he says, so the philosopher goes outside, and what's outside? The sun is out there, and it is illuminating everything. And so rather than looking at shadows cast on a wall, your eyes see the trees and the birds and the clouds, and you actually see things for what they really are. And then here's the terrifying part. Plato describes the philosopher going back into the cave, and he walks down to his friends who are still chained down, looking at the wall. And he says, hey guys, come, I'll break those chains off. Come with me, come outside, and your eyes will actually see everything.
Yep.
They want to kill him.
Yep.
They hate him. They say, don't you, this is what we know right here. We don't want to go outside into the sun. And in that sense, the world of higher education, which began as this effort to help people break free from the shackles, to get away from the illusions and the myths and get out into the sun. That's a metaphor. That's an image that Plato uses. But to see in the light of day what things really are, now the university has become the cave.
Right.
It's the cave. It is casting the illusions and the shadows. And anybody who says, I don't know if that's right, what you guys are doing in the university, you are dismissed as a lunatic, as somebody crazy, or worse, you're attacked, sometimes violently and literally. Sometimes, an attack on your character. Don't take anything that this guy says is true.
What's interesting and what people really struggle with in that conversation is it's not necessarily the immediate reaction. And if you take the actual allegory out and we just talk about the reality of discovering truth, I think all too often people think, well, if I accept the truth, what Plato would say is outside of the cave, all of these things that I believe in are gone. They wouldn't exist anymore at all. When in fact, that's the exact opposite of what Plato is trying to explain through the allegory. What he's trying to explain is there is a chair. What we're sitting in, these are actual chairs. They actually do exist. The only difference is there's a true form. There is a truth of what a chair is, and you're just seeing one version of that. You're seeing a shadow of it. It's not, and we all see those shadows a little different because we're seeing them from different angles, and it's that same mentality that we have today of your truth and my truth and his truth and her truth and their truth, and I don't even know what other pronouns I'm supposed to use, but that's sort of the idea here is Plato isn't saying give up your truth. He's not saying there's no, you can't believe in what you can't believe anything you see. He's just saying there is a truth, and that's the foundation of what you're saying.
Yeah, he's pointing you up. So we're kind of going into the weeds here in Plato, and I'm kind of grooving on it. I kind of like it. I consider myself a Platonist in many respects. One of the things that Plato does that is beautiful is he starts from the world of particulars. You and I both have a cup here. And we could put many other cups, different sizes, different colors, made out of different materials. There could be a tiny little, think of a dollhouse set, might have a little tiny miniature cup. There could be a great big cup that's part of a statue or something like that. And yet there's something they all have in common. And what they all have in common is cupness.
Right.
There's a form of cup that they all participate in, they all share in. And in a way, what's more authoritative than this particular, we could get rid of this particular cup, we could break it, melt it, throw it away, and yet the idea of cupness still exists. It's that what Plato calls the ideas, the forms, it's the basis for language. It's the basis for every common noun, right? Cup, tree, dog, man. These are all common nouns, which means there's some form, and all these particular beings participate in it. And this leads on this wonderful path up to higher things. So then Plato goes into ideas like beauty. We all love beautiful things. Now, in our modern setting, we tend to think of beauty in purely physical, aesthetic terms. A beautiful sunset, a beautiful painting, a beautiful person. But of course, think of a beautiful person. What happens over time to every person? You know, if you think of a physically beautiful, right, like a strikingly, someone to look at that everybody notices that the physical beauty of that person, eventually they get old.
Right.
And they get saggy and wrinkly and not so physically beautiful. Plato says the real lover of beauty doesn't merely love particular beautiful things. The real lover of beauty loves the idea of beauty itself. When you say that person is beautiful or that sunset is beautiful or that painting is beautiful, what is the idea of beauty? What is the form of beauty itself without the sunset, without the person, without the painting? And this leads you up to this level of reality that's intangible, it's invisible, but in a way it's more real than it's what helps us make sense of the physical world around us. And it's what leads us up to the idea of one truth. We call our institutions of higher education, the old term is colleges, and you mentioned before it comes from that Latin root that also means colleague, partnership. But most modern institutions of higher education are called universities. And think of what's implied in that word. It's not multiversities, it's university. There's a oneness to the world. That's a very Platonic concept. There is an idea of the good that unifies everything into a coherent whole. It's what makes reality intelligible. It's why we can exercise our reason and learn the truth about the world. So the very premise of being a university suggests there are not merely perspectives and prejudices and different opinions and feelings. There's a truth, there's one truth, there is one universe, and we can discover things about it. And yet what we find in universities are a bunch of progressive nihilists and perspectivists and critical race theorists and others who want to dismiss all knowledge as mere prejudice, as mere perspective. Leo Strauss once used an image, and it's a powerful image. When you really think through that allegory of the cave, it's a busy allegory. There's a lot going on. You have some people chained down, forced to look at the wall. Then you have other people up above, and they're holding up these images, and there's a fire burning behind them. So it casts shadows on the walls. All this is going. Then you have the philosopher who walks outside. So you have images, and then you have the light of truth outside. Strauss suggested the modern progressive university, it's like a cave beneath the cave. Imagine being in the cave and you go down into a sub-cave. Have you ever been to Cave of the Winds as you head
absolutely.
up? It's in between Colorado Springs and Woodland Park.
Yep.
And when you go through it, at some point they turn off the lights and you're deep inside the bowels of the cave. It's the darkest dark I've ever experienced. I mean, you can't see your own hand right in front of your face. It is dark. Imagine being in that cave. That's the cave of progressivism. That's the cave of nihilism. We don't even have illusions that we can debate over which are more real and right, and can we get out into the light to see what's making the illusions? There's just nothing to see because the premise of higher education is there's no truth. There's just perspectives. There's just prejudices, cultural and personal prejudices about the world. And so part of our work, part of the work of the Vino Veritas Society, that notion of veritas, right? That notion that there is truth is to get back into the cave, to get back into Plato's cave, so that at least we can have a conversation about the images on the walls and what's more or less likely to be true, and maybe walk outside into the sunlight every now and then and actually see reality.
I mean, it's a big part of this class. When I went through it, they ended up, I think this was like the year the movie The Matrix came out.
Yeah.
The original Matrix. And we did a whole couple of weeks segment on comparing this to the Matrix. And the point there is it's not that the world doesn't exist. It's not like the Matrix was just devised off of something that one person just imagined up.
Right.
It's a version of the world. It's just a version that they want you to see. And I feel like that's a lot of what happens in higher education. You get professors who walk in and just say to you, this is the world as you need to understand it. You need to understand that the world is systemically racist. You need to understand that if you're a minority, you don't have a chance to be successful. So you need to rely on government. You need to know that people are bad. That in general, people are bad, but not me, because I was hired to be your professor. So if I was hired to be your professor, I must be good. It's just like if you get elected to government.
And not the unnamed bureaucrats who don't know you. They're good too, even though they don't know you don't know their name and they don't know your name. Well, they probably do know your name. They probably know all about you.
They probably know everything about you.
But they're really looking out for your good.
Right.
No, I think that's right. And so the classical notion of education, there's so much to say about it. Before I forget, I wanted to just remind our listeners, remember what happened to Socrates, the fate of Socrates. The city of Athens, which was in the ancient context, it was the most liberal, open city. It was the freest city compared to other cities of that era and that area.
And clarify that when you say it was the most liberal city, you mean that in the traditional definition of liberal?
The freest city. People were relatively free, unlike, say, neighboring Sparta, which was a military compound. Everything you did in Sparta as a Spartan subject, when you ate, what you ate, where you lived, who you married, how many children you were going to produce, every aspect of your life was governed by law. You did what you were commanded to do. If you were a young boy, by law, you were going to live at home with your mother until you were 6. And after that, once you turned 7, you were off to military training and you served in the army for the rest of your life. And there was no choice about that. In Athens, there was a semblance of property rights. You could choose the way that you wanted to live. In that sense, it was an open, free, classically liberal city. They execute Socrates. They literally and legally kill him. They take his life because they say he is guilty of importing foreign gods and corrupting the youth. And then think about that allegory of the cave. What's Plato suggesting there? He's saying, who's creating myths and illusions? The people up above, behind the city fathers. They're the one. The philosopher is simply seeing the truth, and that's why they want to kill him. Not because he's importing foreign gods. That's being done by the city of Athens, by the city fathers. The philosopher's the one just asking questions, trying to get to the truth.
Let's go back to last week's podcast. The city fathers are the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, that's right.
The city fathers are the terrified people sitting behind the curtain.
Yes.
They're today's progressives.
You know, I hadn't made that connection until you just said that, Dave Rich, and I appreciate that. You're right. The wizard behind his little curtain, that is the cave.
Right.
And most of the people who live in the Emerald City, they are like the people who are chained down, looking at the shadows they see the big, smoky, fiery image of the wizard, and they think that's reality.
It really is.
And yet it's not reality. It's an image, right? And the little dog, Toto, pulls the curtain back, right? Says, there's not some big, fiery, scary guy. There's just this little dude turning dials. And so when we think about that whole classical model of education, what it really meant, educare, the leading away from falsehoods and illusions and lies and untruths and getting out into the light and actually seeing things as they are. It was meant to be incredibly ennobling, empowering, liberating in the highest sense, liberating of the mind. The mind can think freely rather than being constrained by myths and untrue stories and doctrines. And that's actually what progressive universities they've taken that away from students. They've taken it away and they've replaced it with the modern university cripples students by coddling them, by saying, We're here to take any way you think you've been shortchanged in your life, or any way that people were shortchanged generations ago. We're going to coddle you and give you things and supplement you. And because you're a victim, you've suffered all these things. Even if you don't know that you have suffered, you have suffered.
You've
It's
been
a
reading the
tremendous
Jonathan Haidt
disservice.
book.
No, I haven't.
The Coddling of the American Mind.
Oh, I have it, but I haven't opened it yet.
Oh, really?
Is that his argument?
To an
He
extent.
must be a smart guy.
You know, it's interesting because what we don't talk about when you talk about all of those things and the coddling of those students and the lack of a traditional classical education that teaches people how to think rather than what to think.
Yes.
There are real dangers in that. I mean, beyond just we're going to have infighting and we're going to be tribal and we're going to have cultural problems and culture wars and all of these things. We're going to lose the creation of ideas. We're going to lose, they call themselves progressive. They're actually going to take our society's ability to progress intellectually, to progress in terms of goods and services and the way we do things. They're taking all that away because they're telling people, don't bother trying to invent new ways to do things. Your intellectual property is not your property.
Right.
The things in your mind, the things you come up with, the new ways to do things, they don't belong to you. They belong to the world. And you know, it goes back to something that happened last week that's really concerning, and that was Joe Biden going out and giving the recipes for all these vaccines that have been created for the coronavirus. Here, I don't care that this company spent $10 billion trying to come up with this recipe to save all these lives. Here you go create it. And what he doesn't pay attention to, or what his administration, I don't even know. And everybody knows what I mean when I say I don't even know who.
Yeah.
So, but all that did, it went to China. All that did was these countries are saying, we don't have the labs to create this. We don't have the minerals, or we don't have the ingredients. We don't have the methods to go create these safely. If we can't rely on Pfizer, Moderna,
Right.
AstraZeneca to make these for us at a reasonable cost, we're going to give them to China, and China's going to come help us. And for a government to come in and say, we're going to take your intellectual property, Pfizer, and go give it to other countries who are going to give it to China and give it to Russia and say, go make it. It just continues us down this path of, why are we even trying to – the schools are trying to get us to stop coming up with new ideas. Society's trying to get us to stop coming up with new ideas, American society. And now the government is literally saying, we don't really care if you come up with something new.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the details there of what the arrangements were between the United States government and these pharmaceutical companies in terms of intellectual property rights. I know there was an agreement. The federal government basically said, we're going to purchase all that vaccine. So they were guaranteed to make money on that. But regardless, you know, think of everything that those companies, Pfizer, Moderna, had to have in place. They spent years building up that infrastructure. I love to ask questions to either students or people I'm having discussions with. What would it take to invent? I used to like to use the iPhone because it's such a handy device. But given how popular the vaccines are, think of the vaccine. And I want you, the listener, right now to think in your head, what would it take to invent a vaccine for COVID or anything else? And you really start thinking about it. Well, I'm going to need a team of scientists. Well, how much does that cost? Well, that costs a lot of money to go hire a team of scientists. Probably going to need laboratories, probably some pretty sophisticated. How much does that cost? And where do you get all that stuff? Who builds all the laboratory equipment? Who's going to train the scientists? All of a sudden you realize you need a whole lot of people, multiple lifetimes, enormous amounts of capital, billions of dollars or more. Yep. And then you realize these, a little shot that you can get for no charge or very little charge, or an iPhone that you can get for, a few $100s, things like this. you think, wow, what a great deal. It's a much better bargain, right, to plunk down a few dollars in cash rather than to spend multiple lifetimes and billions of dollars of infrastructure and not be guaranteed any kind of success. And all of that happens by free minds thinking freely,
Right.
and thinking well. Thinking well. I think many business owners would agree if we asked them what's the most important thing. The most important thing. There are a lot of qualities you need in good employees and partners, because every business is a kind of college. It's you have colleagues, you're working with them as a partnership. What do you really need? You need people who can think well.
Mm-hmm.
They got to be able to think well. Nothing else matters. If they can't think well, they're not going to speak well. They're not right. They're not going to act well if they can't actually think well. And that used to be the purpose, the highest end of education was to be able to think well, to think clearly, not regurgitate doctrine,
Right.
which is the very notion of indoctrination. In that sense, the modern university system has become a church. It's become a religion. I'm going to go farther. It's become the worst kind of religion, because there are religious teachings that encourage people to think freely and think well, and there are religions that indoctrinate.
Right.
And they try to enslave the mind, and that sort of brings up one of the beautiful things about the United States, which is the whole notion of religious liberty, which in itself it's an entire conversation. We should probably save that for another.
It's not a 5-minute conversation.
No, we're going to tackle that in another podcast, because there's a close parallel between the American idea of religious liberty, a regime of religious liberty, and that classical notion of education. The mind being free and trying to turn. I love that classical sense of education, not as dumping data and facts into a brain, but a turning of the soul, a turning of your eyes, a turning of your attention away from untruths and illusions, and trying to go out and explore and discover what's actually true. That's a beautiful thing, and that's what religious liberty was all about in the American founding.
That turning of your attention, that attempt for discovery, requires the ability, you said it, to think well. And it's so critical that even people who have, we started off this podcast talking about people grow up in certain conditions. They grow up around certain things, and it's just what they believe. They've been told this is true and this is true and this is true, so it must be true. And at one point, college was all about, or education was all about asking questions. Is what I've known to be true actually true? Mm-hmm. Can I feel confident in saying it's true? And can I make a persuasive argument that it is true? And if you can't do that, I don't think you can believe in anything. I don't think you can. This is the whole problem with your truth and my truth and his truth and her truth and their truth and whatever else is.
I like to call that perspectivism, right? The doctrine that there's only perspectives.
And it's perspectivism or progressivism.
Right. Well, right.
But I think that's why we always talk about there's no progress in that. If we can't actually understand, okay, here are the foundations, and I know how to think about it, and I know why this is true. I'm going to end on an analogy of that. You and I both grew up around mechanics. Yep. And we both grew up around cars. Yep. And today, there are two types of people in this world. There are the people who have been indoctrinated with progressivism, who just are told whatever you think is right is right. Mm-hmm. Trial and error. You might if you think it's right, go with it. And if somehow it ends up being wrong, you tried. Your heart was in the right place, right? Right. FDR, your heart was in the right place. Just keep trying.
We spent all your money, but we didn't actually create jobs.
Right. So just keep trying, and if your heart was in the right place, you have your truth. Yeah. And there's the people who know how to think through a problem. From a mechanic standpoint, there are two types of mechanics in the world today. There are actual thinkers who can process here's how an engine is supposed to function. And I can check, here's the entire process. And did this piece work? Yes. Then did it get to here? Yes. Then did it get to here? Yes. And you go through the entire thing.
Yep.
And then there's parts changers. Here's the first step. I'm going to just change this part at the very first step.
Right.
Did that fix the problem? No. But I just spent $200 of your money.
Right.
Now we're going to move. So now I know I put the new part on there. So that must be working. Now we're going to put a new one on the second piece. That didn't help it either. Now you're up to $600. Now we're going to move on. And we have this whole society now of parts changers.
Yeah.
That instead of actually trying to have the education to be able to go out and diagnose a problem and know how to test it and know how to search, it's that scientific method.
Right.
Does this work? Is this working properly? No, yes. Move on to the next. And you create this flow chart. I'm just going to change the part. Did that fix it? Nope. Okay, I'll change the next part.
Dave, I thought you were going to say there are two types of people in the world today, those who know how to drive a manual transmission and those who don't.
Well, there's very few of the former.
If you drive a manual transmission today, your car is very safe from being stolen because the vast majority of possible thieves don't know how to drive a manual transmission.
You're also tend to be very grumpy because the last time I had a manual transmission in Denver and sat in traffic,
yeah.
It is miserable. So it makes you a little more grumpy.
Yeah, I get it.
So I think part of what this has to be about and what I hope our members take away from today is treat your chapter meetings, treat your conversations, go have conversations with your chapters, your fellow guardians, your fellow Poor Richards. Treat them as colleagues in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
Go have conversations.
They're colleges. Each chapter is a college in the traditional meaning of that word, which is partnership. You have a group of people there who are partners. Most of you like each other. You trust each other. And more importantly, you should have a shared love of what is true and helping each other think through and figure out what's ultimately true.
And what I love more than anything about it, I get the benefit of I like to go to a lot of our chapter meetings and hearing the knowledge and the true knowledge that people bring about different things to the table,
right? And
being able to have those interactions and those engagements, it's just a fascinating experience. And I hope our members, our guardians, our Poor Richards continue to try to have those with each other because can learn a lot from each other and be open to each other's ideas.
They should be we're guarding not only the American idea, we're guarding the culture that has developed and blossomed within our chapters.
Absolutely. Continue to be the guardians, no sumus custodes.
Yep.